Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on our authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Good evening. Welcome to the last session on day 4. My name is GACCETTA, and welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. Today is Veterans Day. If there are any veterans watching this evening, I want to wish you a happy Veterans Day. We celebrate whether we're at war or peace, and we celebrate our veterans whether they're alive or whether they have passed. Thank you, Reader's Magnet, for hosting this event again. It has just been a super, super time. The fact that you allow authors to share their stories and share their talents and share whatever they want to share on these live streams, I think is just remarkable. I'd like to offer you all to follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And my author of the hour is next Friday, November the 19th, from 5 to 6 Eastern. I hope you'll stop by. That will be a very fun time. And I'll be talking to somebody other than myself. And last evening, I learned that we had a group of nurses from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City who were having a virtual happy hour watching my presentation. And so I want to give a shout out to all of them and wish them well and thank them for all their services and all that they have done during the pandemic. Actually, let's thank all the nurses and the doctors for the work they've done during the pandemic. Today, Ellie Zates is going to focus on the caregiving changes that have been caused by the pandemic. And caregiving at one point was elderly people taking care of their parents or husbands and wives, sometimes a family member. But the pandemic changed all of that. A recent report from the CDC speaks of the struggles that unpaid caregivers, more normally known as family caregivers, have had during the pandemic. The prevalent issues have been mental health, anxiety, depression, or suicidal thoughts. and they have become more prevalent during the pandemic. The report cites a study at Turner Institute of Brain and Mental Health. The study targeted family caregivers. 40% of all caregivers are unpaid, and that would stand to reason because people that work in senior facilities or assisted living facilities who are paid are also considered caregivers. 85% of the sandwich generation experienced mental health issues during the pandemic. The importance of paying attention to caregiver issues and the need for education and resources to provide support is what the CDC's report focused on. And it was the focus of the study out of the Turner Institute. The pandemic worsened the challenges for caregivers and what they faced. Formal and informal services of support disappeared, such as senior daycare centers and even physical therapy. Seniors who were receiving physical therapy at home were no longer receiving it because of the lockdown. And the daycare centers closed. The senior centers closed in the same way that the child centers closed. Dealing with kids and the elderly parents is complicated and exhausting. Caregiving of an elderly relative is exhausting in and of itself. And for the sandwich generation who had to try to deal with kids who were themselves depressed because they couldn't play with their friends and couldn't go to school, to be teachers, to make sure that they learned remotely online, and then to have to deal with the issues that elderly relatives present in caregiving is indeed complicated and exhausting. Caregivers need more help to cope. Caregivers today, after the pandemic, need more help to cope. Health systems have failed caregivers in that they focus on patients and they do not focus on caregivers. And no one, when you take, and I even experienced this during my time as a caregiver, when you take a relative to the doctor to be seen for whatever ailment that appointment is to deal with, nobody says, "How are you doing?" Nobody says, "How does this affect you? How can we help and support you in your role and responsibilities as a caregiver?" So during the pandemic, unpaid caregivers really had no support. So they truly had to rely on their own inner abilities. And many of them had never been caregivers. So it was baptism by fire. Physicians are now saying we need to take a step back and look at the village around caregivers, because elder patients cannot have a successful outcome if there's no family support for their family caregiver. So now let's go to slide number 1, Nikki. Slide number 1 is something that I've mentioned in the past few days, and that was prior to the pandemic in 2019, AARP reported that there were 1.6 million children between the ages of 8 and 18 who were tasked to take care of elderly relatives. Today, that number is well over 2 million after the pandemic. But if you think about the cost for those kids, is that they have to go home and take care of grandma or grandpa. They can't play with their friends. They can't participate in after-school activities. They can't be a child. Caregiving and the plot that we find ourselves in now is truly robbing our children of their childhood. let's go to number 2, Nick. Number 2 is called The Hidden Pandemic. Last month in the journal Pediatrics, it was reported that 1 in 515 children in the United States have been orphaned with one or both parents dying from COVID-19. And this is now referred to as the hidden pandemic. Those numbers are larger for children of color. And the children of color were not only Black and brown, they were also children who live on the Native American reservations. And there's been no reported assistance being provided to these families. One or both parents of these kids, and now they're orphaned, they either don't have one or two of their parents, or they're on the street, they're living with other family members. The causes that follow such just a horrific thought is what happens to the families, what happens to the children, what happens to how long does it take them to recover, how long does it take them to go back into a society that will accept them and that they can move forward with some sort of success in their situations. And as long as we are in a pandemic, it's going to take a lot longer. Nikki, you want a number 3, please? The millennial caregivers have now become essentially the largest group of individuals in this country giving caregiving. Fairgoer 713 is asking the question if discrimination worsened during the pandemic in my state. I would have to say to you, it does not appear that it has worsened. Colorado right now is 1 in 51 people in this state have COVID-19. Even though close to 70% of our population has been vaccinated, we still have pockets in this state where they never wore masks and they never felt that the pandemic was real. I read a report just earlier today that people in the hospitals in this state are still now saying they don't have COVID-19, they just have pneumonia, or they've contracted some sort of a virus. So I don't know that discrimination has worsened, but I do know that people in general do not, even though 70% of the population is vaccinated, almost 400,000 people in this state have received their booster shots. It is the variant knows no bounds. I guess maybe that's how you describe it. COVID knows no bounds. COVID is just out to get whoever COVID can get. And we are back in Colorado and wearing more masks and staying in again more than we did. So I don't know that it's discrimination. Maybe it's just discrimination against everybody because the virus won't go away. Millennials, again, I'll go back to point number 3. Millennials are becoming the fastest growing group of caregivers in the United States. They have an online presence, as you would anticipate that millennials would do. They look for help through social media. They look for people to say it's okay for you to want to take care of yourself. I have been following a young woman who's struggling. She's struggling because she wants to take a kickboxing class but the relative that she's caring for, she can't leave alone, and she doesn't have the financial resources, not being able to sustain full-time employment, to find someone to come in and help her. So this particular group of millennials who are on these sites are trying to scramble to help each other, to find assistance. And that's the beauty of social media, is that if you dig long enough, you can find what you're looking for, or at least find a link to where you are. My message to the people who think the pandemic is not real is that almost 800,000 people in this country have died from it. My message to the people who say, Aunt Carmela didn't die from COVID. She was already going to hospice. She was already dying. Her kidneys were failing. She went to the emergency room and she contracted COVID in the emergency room. She didn't die from COVID. And you kind of look at them and say, she had COVID when she died. Yeah, she did die. It exacerbated her time. She went a lot quicker than she probably would have. And even though she was in her 90s, she had COVID. And my message would be to say, on the one hand, my message would be to say, get a shot. When I was a kid growing up, and we had to get polio was, and I was a little girl, and we had to get polio shots. People rolled up their arms. Diseases didn't come with political affiliations or such strong beliefs that you had a choice. And today there is a big group who are anti-vaxxers, but we're far better off with the vaccinations. You don't have the mumps, you don't have the measles, you don't have rubella, you don't have tetanus, you don't have. They get shots for what was just common everyday diseases that every kid got when I was growing up, including me. So I think it's just to take it serious. Almost 1 million people in this country have died from it. So it's not really a fluke. And to be real honest with you, I don't know how you get a message across to someone who's just really made up their mind that it's not real until they get it. And then when they get to the hospital, they want every available intervention that there is so that they can go back home and say it's not real. Let's move on to the next slide, Nikki. Families have become multifaceted in caring for the elderly while they are raising children who are in the K to 12 range. And I just spoke about this, and this is the sandwich generation. This is the next generation that has truly suffered during the pandemic. These are people who knew that there was going to be a lockdown. These are people who understood that there were issues and problems, and they either took their loved ones out of senior care facilities to try to care for them at home because they knew they would not have access to them. And it has become then the pandemic hit, kids weren't allowed to go back to school. Many of the parents were trying to work remotely from home. Some of them lost their jobs altogether. So then they had the financial burdens of how do you care for an elderly relative at the same time you're trying to provide for your own children. It just turned into a terrible problem, really. And people had to learn how to cope. They had to learn how to be a teacher and a caregiver, how to continue earning a living. And it's been a struggle. Now, the flip side of that is the multifaceted family a lot of times isn't such a bad deal because the elderly relatives will help teach the children. They may teach them about their culture. They may teach them about what life was like when they were growing up. They add a totally different dimension to, let's go to the soccer game. We got to go play soccer. You got a music lesson. We got a tuba lesson. There's a parent teacher association meeting this evening, whatever they call them now. And now you've got an elderly relative living in your home who may require some help, but by the same token, they can really offer a lot to a family as well in their own perspective. And that's assuming that they're not terribly, terribly ill. And even if they're ill, they still have those moments of clarity when they can be truly a blessing to be in a family. Let's go on to number 5. Caregivers are often left behind. They're not part of the modern society, and they're not part of the modern family. And I can use my own experience to talk about this particular one. I was pretty much isolated within these 4 walls that I'm in right now for 4 months shy of a decade. When my mother passed away and I dared to get in my car and start driving or start seeing, the world had changed. Denver didn't look like Denver. So much building had occurred. People were acting different. One of the first questions that I asked, I had not been to dinner. I had not been out to dinner in maybe 8 years. And one of the first questions that I asked was, when did a salad become $8? And the answer to that was, well, wait till you have to start paying $3 for a glass of iced tea on top of that $8 salad. And this is what true caregivers will experience. You have to reintegrate back into the world. If you've been a caregiver for the amount of time that I was a caregiver, and quite frankly, even for some who have just been caregivers during the pandemic, the world has changed. And the world changes and people move on. The world moves on. Your friends leave you. People that you thought were your friends, they move on. They're not going to wait for you. And the people that stay with you are people who understand what you're going through. They understand what it is to be a caregiver. They understand what it is to be where you are and to be in your place. And frankly, I have 3 friends. And I started out with lots and lots and lots of people who would want to go places and want to do things. But then when it became, I can't just pick up and leave. I have to make sure that I have someone to stay. I have to make sure that I'm back at a certain time. I can't just leave. And so they move on without you. And the world moves on without you. I hadn't been to a mall. I'd been to a mall once in 5 years. And that was at a time when my mother was in the hospital. I took a day and walked to the mall. And I panicked because I couldn't believe how expensive everything had gotten, because I was wearing yoga pants and t-shirts in the winter, and I was wearing shorts and t-shirts in the summer. I wasn't going to work where I had to be fashionable or to be dressed. And you're not part of the modern family. A month after my mother passed away, I went on vacation with my brother's family. And I was with family, and they were happy to have me, and I was delighted to be with them. But my late sister-in-law said to me, well, we've got a few days, let's go to the mall. And they started to show me how to dress after 10 years. they started to show me, try this on and let's do that. And yeah, I spent a lot of money, but you know what? I didn't have a thing in my closet to wear if I had to go anywhere. So even though it's been 4 years, I'm still learning, and caregivers are still left behind. The question that came in from Fairgrower 1023 asked, what did I do to keep myself sane during the pandemic? I'd lived alone for 10 years, so I had no issues. I was able to keep busy. I was in my kitchen. I was walking. I was doing everything that I did. But what kept me sane during the pandemic was writing this so that it could be published. That's what kept me sane during the pandemic. Was it took me almost 6 months to transfer this, my Generations of Good Food book, to transfer it from a handwritten binder that I had put together after my mother passed away for my nieces to a document, a manuscript that could have been published. That's how that came about, and that's how I remained sane during the pandemic. Was it just kept my mind busy. And I also live in a neighborhood where, you know, people were complaining that the cleaning lady wasn't coming. People were complaining that Hobby Lobby had closed and they couldn't do their crafts. And so you keep sane because you see other people have become very based on shallowness. So the cleaning lady doesn't come. You're perfectly healthy. Clean your house. It's kind of a no-brainer. And it's a way to stay busy, and it's a way to keep your mind engaged. Fairgoer 627 said, what is the character, excuse me, the most needed character of a person to be a caregiver? And I still think a lot of it is patience. I think a lot of it is patience. You have to not let things bother you. You have to have a commitment. You have to have a commitment that you're going to see this through. And unless you have a very significant illness that comes up to where your parent you can't take care of them, then you have to go another route. How's life now that my mother passed away? My life is fine. My life is fine. I remodeled my house. I travel until the pandemic. I traveled, but I've done some traveling in the last couple of months. I'm getting back into that. I'm thoroughly engaged with my family now. I'm back to being part of the life. I'm going to dinner with friends and family. I've joined a club at the insistence of a friend of mine who maintains I've become a social introvert. And next week I'm going to the first meeting. So we'll have to see if I really have become a social introvert, because I really think I have. So I'm going to learn how to do that. Let's go on to number 6, Nikki. Number 6 is caregivers. Today, caregivers have far more availability to community resources than I did. There are many, many more organizations that will help guide you through program requirements, government requirements, more local requirements. And when we went through the social media, when we went through all the social media requirements, the LE social media sites the other night, it seems that more and more and more social media sites are indeed geared toward hearing your story. What are you going through? How are you feeling? What are you dealing with? Here's something in your state. This is the law in your state, because Medicare is a national program. It is the same for every state. Medicaid is a state administered program, and it varies greatly by the benefits, and each state has their own laws. So if you're going to have your loved one transferred to Medicaid, it's then you need to deal with the local authorities. And in Colorado, we would deal with our county Department of Human Services. Let's move on to the next one, Nikki. Access to seniors in care facilities. Thank you, Shine. I hope it is informative. As the COVID-19 variants have hit the various parts of the country, access to relatives, and this has really been something that I have noticed, particularly with a lot of my friends. Access to seniors in nursing homes, assisted living, really changed. Now it's a total different environment. And as COVID-19 would rear its ugly head, they would lock down, they would open up, they would lock down. Initially, patients were kept in their rooms. During the initial lockdown, all the doors were shut. Those patients had no contact with anyone except maybe a nurse on a shift. Maybe the nurse might go in a couple times with their mask and their gown and their shield. Everybody looked like they were from another planet to those old people laying in those beds and in those rooms. They saw nobody. Meals were brought to their rooms. Family visits consisted of standing outside the window, and perhaps the nurse would open the window and you could actually hear them, or you just stood outside the window and waved so you would see them and they would see you. I have a dear friend whose mother is in a facility in a town in Northeast Colorado, and they would wheel her mother to the front door for 15 minutes every 3 or 4 weeks. And she could see her mother every 15 minutes through the front door. They couldn't talk, they couldn't touch. She had no idea if her mother had clothes. She had no idea if her mother's room was being cared for. She had no idea if she was sick. She had no idea. She just saw this little lady in a wheelchair through double glass doors, 15 minutes every couple of weeks. Then as summer rolled around last year in 2020, family members were allowed then to visit once weekly for 30 minutes outside with their masks and with the care facility staff, making certain that everybody was distanced, everybody was in masks. You couldn't touch them, you couldn't hug them, you couldn't touch them. You could just talk to them, and as Elaine has said to me a number of times, I would say, "Mom, how are you?" And she would look at the nurse and say, "So tell her, how am I?" So they were even afraid in some cases to talk for themselves. Eventually, they were allowed back indoors. As last winter came around, they were allowed back indoors, but she would have to have a mask, a shield, and a full gown on. She could stay as long as she wanted, but her mother had no idea who she was. Her mother would say, "Who are you? I don't know who you are." And she would occasionally pull down her mask and show her face, but then she had to put it back up again because the rules were the rules. Families were eventually allowed to visit. And then if there was a COVID outbreak in the facilities, they went into a lockdown. I spoke with my friend last week, and they just opened her mother's facility as it was pre-pandemic a couple of weeks ago. But she texted me today and said there's a COVID breakout in the nursing home. They've shut it down again. So I think this is going to go on. And these poor people are all alone. As they are alone, their mental decline has been just dramatic. They have slept for the last 17, 18 months. Most of them could not watch television unless somebody turned it on or turned it off. Um, they're in those beds and they've just kind of existed. So that has been probably the biggest change. Pandemic has been, what has it done to the people who need the most care? And number 8, and this is kind of the toll on seniors, is kind of a continuation of that, which is medical articles now more and more reflect on the mental decline of elderly patients due to no human contact with their loved ones. What advice do I have for younger children or the younger generation who are caring for their elderly relatives? Depends upon their age. If they're in their 20s, this is really tough because the millennial generation is used to, they got wheels on their butt. They're used to going. They're used to being out and about. They're used to being in the clubs. They're used to, nobody was used to staying home and cooking themselves a meal. They were used to stopping by Whole Foods or the grocery store and picking up something at the deli or grabbing something at the fast food place or meeting their friends at a restaurant. And that all changed. There's a part of me that feels really bad about it, but there's a part of me that thinks maybe it's really a bolt of lightning, that it's time to kind of take a step back and recognize and realize what's important and what's not. And I know that's really hard. But caring for a senior is not a life sentence. It will at some point cease. And certainly the pandemic has caused people to suffer significantly. Even for the grandparents who could only wave at their kids and see their new grandbabies at the end of the garage. They were standing at the garage door. They're standing at the house and they're holding up a brand new baby on the driveway. What is my go-to activity when I feel bored due to the lockdown? Well, I've kind of been in a different situation. My brother's wife was very sick last year during the prime of the pandemic, and so I spent a lot of time with his kids, watching family, being part of the family. And my go-to activity is, my kitchen is my happy place. I walk, I go out. I'm out and about. I live in an area that has beautiful walking paths and a lot to see. And I have a 2.5 or 3 mile route that I go through. I do some online research for my books, for events such as this. And I don't have a problem keeping myself busy, and I rarely get bored. I'm different. And I had 10 years when I didn't have a time to even think about getting bored. Didn't have time to think about anything. And I guess that has stayed with me. I'm happy. My life is good. I'm happy. I'm blessed. And so rather than get bored, and rather than feel sorry for yourself, or rather than wonder what you're going to do, find something. There's always something to do. You can be busy. You can be busy. You can busy your mind. You can busy your hands. That's my advice. My advice is, I don't get being bored because I seldom am. Now, when the Festival of Storytellers ends at the end of next week, I will put up my Christmas tree. And then I'll start getting ready for Christmas. I'm hosting the Christmas gathering. It's my turn. It's my year to host the cousins. And so we're talking about what are we going to have and what are we going to do. So I don't get bored. I haven't been terribly bored. I just find what to do. There's always something you can do. And so for the wrap up, let's do a wrap of day 8. We've had the kids from 8 to 18 taking care of their elderly relatives. We've had the hidden pandemic of those children who have lost one or both of their parents to COVID-19. We've had the millennials being knocked off their feet and into a mode of caregiving that is foreign. Families have become multifaceted, taking care of kids as well as taking care of the elderlies. The caregivers are left behind and that the world moves on without them. There are far more community resources available on social media and thankfully for caregivers now. Having access to seniors in the facilities during the pandemic was hard, and it took a very serious toll on the seniors. Before I sign off here, and I've gone beyond my time, but before I sign off, I want to just remind you that I am the author of Generations of Good Food, which is a 200-page compilation of recipes from my mother's 6 generations of my mother's family. And then, of course, the book that I'm featuring here now is One Caregiver's Journey, which is about 9.5 years of caregiving for my mother when she fell and broke her hip at 93 and passed away here in my home at 102. I hope this has been helpful. Look forward to you tomorrow evening. And I guess we'll sign off for tonight. Bye for now.